Good evening and welcome to our second and final class of the State of Israel. I'm Michele, the Senior Director of JLearn, and we welcome all new and returning students to join us tonight. With us tonight, and with enormous thanks, we have Dr. Howard Lupovitch, Director of the Cohn Haddow Center at Wayne State University, as well as a professor at Wayne State, and Rabbi Michele Faudem, who is a JLearn instructor, the Hillel Rabbi at Wayne State University for Wayne and neighboring campus Hillels, and a proud dual citizen of Israel and the U.S., along with being an even prouder mother to an IDF soldier. I hope you found last week's sessions to be informative and empowering. We heard from many of you who felt it was extremely worthwhile. This week has been another extremely difficult week, especially for the Detroit community. We suffered the horrific loss of beautiful Samantha Wall, the president of the Isaac Agri Downtown Synagogue and an admired leader in local civic and political circles. I am one of the very few in the area who was not privileged enough to know her personally, but I do know she was a bright light that stood for kindness, understanding, and bridging communities. She was taken much too young, and our condolences go out to all of her friends and family. We dedicate this night of learning and understanding in honor of Sam's shining memory. I again want to thank our community partners that joined us in bringing you this event. They're all listed above. We are extremely fortunate for the unity within the Detroit area. They are also listed in the packet of notes that you have. Tonight, we are going to turn our attention to the Jewish response to captives, as well as talking points when having those difficult conversations with those that may feel very different. As we get started, I ask you to please silence your cell phones. We are recording tonight's session, and it will be sent out within a few days to all registered students. It does take a few days longer than the Zoom link that came out last week. It's a different process, so be on the lookout. The end of the week, maybe Monday. We do ask that you not share it with anybody that was not registered in this program for privacy purposes. You should have all received a packet of handouts, and within there you will find reference sheets for tonight's discussion, as well as a timeline and map that further illustrates last week's conversation. That's on the last page. We will be taking questions that have been submitted in writing only at the end of the evening. I will be walking around to pick up the cards. I can also hand them out if you weren't able to pick one up outside at the table. And if you're sitting in the middle of the aisle and have written down a question, please just pass it to the side so that grab it from whoever's on the end of the aisle. Please know that we're not going to have time, I'm sure, for as many questions as you have. Maybe we'll revisit this another time with just a Q&A session, I'm not sure. But at this time, I turn this over to Rabbi Faudem and Dr. Lupovitch as we begin with a prayer for our hostages, which is in your packet. Please join Dr. Lupovitch and read along.
Our God, the one who raised Joseph up from the pit, be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. Send complete rescue and full redemption to those held captive by the enemy. Strengthen their spirit and bring them our prayers, that they may be protected from all harm. Implant understanding in the heart of the enemy, that they may return the captives in wholeness of body and spirit. Grant wisdom to the Israel Defense Forces, that they may secure freedom for the captives without loss of life. Grant strength of spirit and courage of heart to all the sons and daughters of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, to release bonds of captivity and allow us all to live in freedom. And they shall call upon me, and I will answer them. I will be with them in distress. I will rescue them and honor them. And we say, Amen. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shelley, for that nice introduction. I'll just add one thing. In addition to everything you said, we are both proud graduates of Hillel Day School, which I always make a point of saying that no matter what the event is. I think it's just worth saying. I don't even think it's just a coincidence. Whatever, it doesn't matter. We are both. But before I turn it over to Rabbi Faudem, I'm just going to make one little addendum or one comment from what we talked about last week. If you're with us, if not, it'll just take a second. Last week I made reference to the Hamas Charter of 1987 and urge you to look at it online. What I didn't mention, what I forgot to mention, is that charter was, I would say, slightly revised in 2017. I mean, the major talking points still come through. They softened some of the harshest language, and they took out some of the most, or they softened some of the most explicit anti-Semitic language, but it's all still there, especially if you look at Article 17 and Article 20. So I just wanted to mention that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Faudem, who will take us through this very important and interesting issue.
Thank you, Dr. Lupovitch.
Dr. Lupovitch.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Tonight we're going to be discussing the topic of Jewish responses to redeeming captives. You have in front of you on the colored papers, you have in front of you source sheets. I am not going to cover every source in this packet. I'm going to spend more time on a few of them, less time on others, but I wanted you to have as many sources as possible. Okay, so the question is, are we permitted or obligated to redeem captives? And if so, is there a limit that we should pay for their release? And then why would there be a limit that we would place on the release? So the first instance we have of captive release is found actually in Genesis chapter 14, where Abraham has to redeem his nephew Lot. Fantastic. That's our text 1. Text 2, we're jumping ahead to the medieval time period. We're looking at Maimonides here. And in Maimonides, I brought here from the Maimonides text, I brought 2 halachot, 2 laws. And the big thing that I want us to see out of these 2 laws from Maimonides is that the ransoming of captives takes precedence over feeding and clothing the poor. And then Maimonides goes on and gives us details. He gives us citations of how we can prove how important this mitzvah is of redeeming captives. And then he goes on in Law 11, and he even tells us if we're raising money, if we've raised money to build a synagogue for ourselves, we are supposed to take that money, even for a shul, and we are allowed to, only for redeeming captives, are we allowed to take that pool that we've raised for building a shul, and we are now obligated to take that money and redeem captives. And not only if we've raised the money, but if we've bought the materials to build that shul, we're supposed to take those materials, sell them, take that money, and use that money to redeem the captives. But this is only true with regard to redeeming captives. If it's for any other mitzvah, we have our shul money, and then we have to raise more money. Again, reinforcing this idea, how important this mitzvah is of redeeming captives. Everyone with me? Just give me a nod. Okay, good, fantastic. Text 3 is, again, another important piece about how important it is, another text, how important it is for us to redeem captives. Text 4. Text 4 comes from a Mishnah. Now, in all of my source sheets, I try to give time periods, authors, and places for where these texts are from. Why? It's important for us to know the time period and the context in which these texts are written. So this Mishnah, the Mishnah is a text from 3rd century BCE to 3rd century CE, and it was compiled by a man by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Okay? Covers a ton of topics. We're looking at one little snippet. That snippet comes from Masachet Gittin, the Tractate of Gittin, which traditionally deals with gets, Jewish divorce documents, but like any other good Jewish conversation, you have tangents. And that's what we have here. This has nothing to do with the Jewish divorce document, but it's still in this tractate. So here it is. I'm in text 4. Captives may not be ransomed for more than their value for the sake of the social order. Okay? Very clear directive right here. We are not allowed to redeem captives for more than their value. The reason is for the sake of the social order. We're going to talk about that. We're going to unpack that. The first thing we need to figure out is, what's their value? Right? How are we going to figure out someone's value? Think time period. You're not going to like this answer, but such is the case. It was what the person would go for on the slave market. Right? Depending on gender, age, health, strength, etc. That was how they figured out what that person's value would be. Text 5. Text 5 is a Babylonian Talmud, the same tractate of Gittin 45a. The Mishnah was compiled and transmitted orally until about the year 200 CE, and then it was written down. Orally means it's got to be short. The Babylonian Talmud unpacks each Mishnah and gives us all of the if, ands, and buts. So now we're going to look at this question. The question was raised, does this social order derive from concern over imposing too heavy a burden on the community, or from concern lest we encourage bandits to kidnap people and offer them for ransom? So here we've got this Babylonian Talmud that's unpacking our Mishnah. Text 5 is unpacking text 4, and it's asking the question, what does social order mean? Does social order mean that we're concerned about, that we put a cap on the value of what we're going to ransom people for because of our concern that we're going to put a financial burden on the community? Or is it because we're concerned that if we pay too high of an amount, we're going to encourage people to kidnap more and more Jews? At this point in time, it was good business to kidnap Jews. Why? Because the bandits knew the Jewish community would pay to get Jews back. That's all it was at this. It was good business. Kidnap a Jew, tell the community we've got them, and see how much they're going to pay. So here, the rabbis are so smart, they're already concerned about what this is going to do to the community. So we've got two possibilities. One, bankrupting the community. Two, is it going to encourage people to kidnap more Jews? Because if it can get more money, then it's going to encourage people to broaden their business. Everyone good? Okay. So here we go. We're now going to look at text 8. Text 6 and 7, which we're skipping, talk about this idea of what happens if I want to redeem someone personally rather than the community. Can I do that? Instead of putting it on the community to do that, we're not paying attention to that right now. We're going to go down to text 8. Text 8 is what's called the Tosafot. So I told you there was a Mishnah, then I told you there was an unpacking of that Mishnah, and that's in the Babylonian Talmud. God forbid we stop there. We've got another layer, and that layer is called the Tosafot. The Tosafot are a commentary on what's called the Gemara, which is in the Talmud. So it's a commentary on the unpacking of the Mishnah. So we've got three layers here. We've got our Mishnah, we've got our Babylonian Talmud, we're really the Gemara, which is the unpacking of the Mishnah, and then right now we have a commentary on the unpacking of our original text. Everyone good? Okay, so our text 8 reads, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah ransomed the child at great expense because he was unusually knowledgeable. Or perhaps during the period of the destruction of the temple, the problem of stimulating further kidnappings is not pertinent. So we have our Mishnah, we have our Babylonian Talmud. Our Mishnah said, we do not redeem captives for more than they're worth. That's the rule. The Babylonian Talmud unpacks for us. We don't do this because of social order. What does social order mean? Financial burden, or lest we encourage people to kidnap others. Now, fantastic, what do we all know happens when we get a rule? Immediately, it's going to be followed by exceptions. So here, we're going to see what the exceptions are. This exception right here is dealing with Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania. And here, this Tosafot, this commentary on the unpacking of the Mishnah, is giving us two possible exceptions. One is the person who is ransomed, who is kidnapped, is very, very bright or is going to be a great leader. Put that one aside. The second one is the one that really is more pertinent to us today. And that is the exception of, God bless you, the exception of ransoming captives beyond their limit may not apply in a time where it's so bad that it has no possibility of making it worse by redeeming a captive for more than their value. Everyone with me? So if we are in a time, that second destruction of the second temple, things were so bad at that point that by us paying more to redeem that captive, they're saying things were already so bad, it doesn't matter what we would have paid. It couldn't have gotten any worse. That's an exception to our rule. Okay. Text 9. Text 9 is another Tosafot. And here we've got a third reason that we can go outside of redeeming them for more than they're worth. And that is, whatever price may be demanded, this is a quote from the Babylonian Talmud, and now the Tosafot is going to unpack that quote. What does that mean? When the captive is in mortal danger, we are to offer ransom even more than his value. So if it's deemed that the person who was kidnapped is in mortal danger, then we are allowed to disregard the Mishnah, which has told us that we cannot redeem the captive for more than their value. If it's deemed that this person is in mortal danger, we can redeem them for more than what their value is. So we've got our three exceptions. Exceedingly bright. It's not going to stimulate any greater number of abductions. And the third one is the captive is in mortal danger. Everyone with me? Okay. So here, we're going to move on to today. How do any of these texts impart or impact what we're dealing with today? They do. There's a tremendous connection here. These guys were dealing with the same thing that we're dealing with right now. So let's look at this. Prisoner exchanges from the state of Israel have been fraught with ethical dilemmas since the beginning. The exchange often is for thousands of terrorists for several Israeli soldiers, and today we're dealing with both soldiers and civilians. Sometimes the soldiers are alive, sometimes it's just to get their bodies back. But prisoner exchanges have been a topic that has been fraught with controversy since the beginning of the reestablishment of the State of Israel. And there's been tremendous debate about them. The first one that's probably the biggest one that we've dealt with was 1985, which was known as the Dribril deal. And in that one, we exchanged 3 IDF soldiers for 1,000, and I have my number, 1,150 terrorists. 2005, there's a Jerusalem Post report that reported that of those prisoners that were released, 48% of them resumed their terrorist activity. The issue's further complicated by another important factor. The price that Israel is asked to pay is the release of large number of terrorists held in Israeli prisons. By releasing these convicted terrorists, what are we doing to other Jewish lives? We're putting them in jeopardy. The organizations that fostered these people, these terrorists, are also strengthened and encouraged because they know when they commit such a crime, all they have to do is sit there until another one of their comrades does another heinous act, and then what will happen? They will be exchanged. The Gilad Shalit deal, which was in 2011, Gilad Shalit was held for 5 years. That one was in exchange for 1,027 prisoners, terrorists. 280 of those prisoners were life in prison for attacks on Israeli targets. From those that were released, those terrorists that were released, dozens went back to their terrorist activities. And as of 2015, which is 8 years ago, 6 Israelis had been killed. Imagine the number in the last 8 years of how that's grown. We have to ask ourselves, who among those barbarians who participated in the October 7th terrorist attack, slaughter, and massacre were released for Gilad Shalit? Text 10. Text 10 and text 11 are 2 modern day texts. Everything that we've been dealing with up until now is earlier text. Mishnah is 3rd century BCE to 3rd century CE, and the Tosaf, and we've got the Gemara, the Talmud, which is 5th, 6th century CE, and then we have the Tosafists, who are from anywhere from 12th to 14th century. And we also had Maimonides in there, who is also medieval time. The last 2 texts we're going to look at are 2 modern day texts. The first one, which is our text 10, is Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, Aselecha Rav is the book, and here's what he says. Oh, wait, for all the sources above relate to highway bandits, whose entire objective is to extort the maximum amount of money for the release of their captives or the sale as slaves. It is thus clear and obvious that any capitulation to their demands will only whet their appetites for and encourage their seizure of specifically Jewish captives whose communities are prepared to pay high sums for their release. We, however, are mired in a protracted, difficult war with the entire Palestinian nation, from which groups have emerged who are fighting mercilessly against the Jewish people in its land on national political grounds. It is a war which, as long as no solution is found, will become increasingly bitter. These terrorist groups do everything in their power to inflict the greatest possible harm upon the Jewish people. There is no doubt that were they able to sacrifice their lives to capture Jewish prisoners, they would do so on a daily basis in order to free their own prisoners and captives who are in Israeli hands, and perhaps also to achieve further political goals. Regarding this issue, we have already written in the spirit of Tosafot's second answer that they should not seize even more, that this concept does not apply at the time of the destruction of the temple, that so too, in our present war, that concept that they should not seize even more does not apply. We must, however, reiterate that there is no conclusive reason based on the previous sources to prohibit prisoner exchanges, since any proofs from them can be refuted. When a soldier knows if he is captured, the state of Israel in her entirety is standing behind him to free him, he will give his life, his full effort, when he is fighting without fear. But if the law functions in a way that we do not redeem captives for more than their worth, when soldiers are sent on a national mission of war, then each soldier will say in his heart, "It is better for me to retreat than to fall into captivity." Who is able to measure what is going to be a greater threat to national security? The strengthening of the terrorists with the release of their friends? Or the strength or morale among the IDF soldiers in their never-ending war in which we find ourselves fully engaged? So here we've got Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, and he wrote this, if you look at the text 10, he wrote this in 1986, which was right after the Jibril deal. And here he was trying to say, wait a second, this deal that we put forth was not against Jewish law for two reasons. One, just like we saw earlier in our Mishnah, that at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, it couldn't get any worse, so we could pay more for those captives than they're worth. He's saying the same thing applies now. We're not going to stop these guys from kidnapping or maiming or terrorizing our soldiers. So you know what we need to do? We're permitted to pay more than they're worth. And the second one, our soldiers know. If God forbid they are taken, they are kidnapped, they know that the entire state of Israel is behind them and is going to do anything and everything to get them back. Imagine if they thought otherwise. What would they do if they knew that we wouldn't go out of our way and pay more than they're worth? They're going to start thinking, wait a second, I'm going to step back because I don't want to be taken, because I'm not sure I'm going to be redeemed. So Rabbi Halevi says, which one is more of a threat to national security? He says that second. We need our soldiers to know that we're going to come and redeem them at whatever cost. Everyone with? Text 11. Text 11 is Rabbi David Galinkin. This was written in October of 2003, and this is in response to a deal that took place in October of 2000 when Elchanan Tenenbaum and the bodies of three Israeli soldiers that had been kidnapped and killed in Lebanon there was this exchange. Here's what he says. Since 1971, many rabbis have written responsa about our current dilemma. Most have ruled that Israel may not exchange hundreds or thousands of terrorists for a few Israeli soldiers. Chief Rabbi Shlomo Goren says that we learn from the Mishnah in Gittin, our text 4, that we do not pay more than their value. It is true that the Tosafot in Gittin 58a, our text 9, said that when there is danger to the captive, we may indeed pay more than the captive is worth. He adds that the safety of one or a few Jews in captivity does not take precedence over the safety of the entire public. Finally, in our case, freeing hundreds or thousands of terrorists definitely endangers the public because the terrorists will be free to attack Israel and to take more hostages. Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, who was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, admits that Rabbi Goren's ruling, based on Gittin and the rulings of leading authorities, is clear and correct. Nonetheless, he disagrees with Rabbi Goren. All of the sources quoted deal with robbers who kidnap people for money, but we are dealing with a war based on Palestinian nationalism. They will continue to kidnap Jews regardless of what we do, so the price we pay for captives is not a factor and does not increase terror. The government decided that if a soldier sees that the state will not redeem him for a high price, he will prefer retreat to capture. This too can be considered a halachic innovation. Therefore, Israel did not act against Jewish law in exchanging 1,150 terrorists for 3 Israeli soldiers. Rabbi Goren and many rabbis compare our dilemma to the Mishnah and say that hundreds or thousands of terrorists is an excessive price to pay for a few Israeli soldiers. This type of exchange will endanger the public by increasing kidnapping and setting loose thousands of terrorists. Rabbi Chaim David Halevi says the Mishnah in Gittin is not really relevant to our dilemma because at that time, robbers kidnapped for money, while Palestinian terrorists for nationalistic reasons, and the price we pay will not alter their attempts to kidnap. I was not asked by the Israeli government for my opinion, but if I were asked, I would reluctantly agree with the majority of Israeli rabbis who have written on this subject. I am certainly in favor of halachic innovation as Rabbi Halevi, but I think he is missing the plain meaning of the Mishnah. We must not pay excessive ransom for the sake of tikkun olam, for the public good. In other words, the public takes precedence over the individual, even if this endangers the individual. Exchanging hundreds or thousands of terrorists for one Israeli encourages kidnapping of more Israelis and frees those who will pick up their weapons and attack Israel. In other words, it endangers the public and should not be done. So here in our last 2 texts, we have 2 rabbis using the same texts coming to 2 different opinions. Welcome to Jewish life. We have Halevi who's saying the Mishnah tells us we cannot redeem for more than they're worth, but he says because the Mishnah was talking about redeeming for money and not for nationalistic reasons, it doesn't apply here. And he says because the Mishnah doesn't apply here, we can redeem for more than they're worth because he doesn't believe that's going to increase the number of kidnappings any more than it already is. He said people are going to do it whenever they can. So by us paying more, it doesn't increase the numbers of possible kidnappings. Rabbi Galinkin gives us the opposite answer. He says our obligation is to follow that Mishnah. And while that Mishnah tells us that we cannot redeem for more than they're worth, he says the reason we can't do that is because our job is to look out for the Israeli public. And sometimes that means that the individual has to take a back seat. Their safety is put second because it's an individual versus a group. The last pieces here we have, God forbid we should stop with two. When Rabbi Goren republished his essay on this topic, he agreed with Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli that the government must take full responsibility for its soldiers, just as one may pay an exorbitant price to redeem oneself. As an individual, I can pay whatever price I want to redeem myself, and that is also true, go with the traditional model, for my wife. My wife is considered to be an extension of me. Since I can pay anything to redeem myself, I can pay anything to redeem my wife. Everyone with me? Rabbi Avadia Yosef contended that we must give priority to the life of the captured soldier who is in danger in his service on behalf of the state of Israel over the uncertain threat to the public. Here we're talking about certainty versus uncertainty. We know that that Israeli soldier, we can expand that to civilians, are in definite danger. We're not so sure what's going to happen with those released terrorists. We have to go with what's right in front of our faces and make a decision based on that. Everyone with me? Last piece. Rabbi Shlomo Aviner stated that we should use military means to free captured soldiers. This position was supported by chiefs of military intelligence who believe we should never leave a soldier behind on the battlefield, but that the government cannot bring them home at any price. So just for a summary, redeeming captives is a religious duty of supreme importance. Nevertheless, the Mishnah, our text 4, put a limit on the amount of ransom that can be offered. It should not exceed the value of the captive. We gave two explanations for this. One suggested that it would deplete the resources of the Jewish community, and the second is to prevent further acts of aggression. Third point, the state of Israel has been faced with continued redeeming of captive dilemmas. Terrorist organizations capture Israeli soldiers and civilians and seek not monetary compensation, but the release of convicted terrorists, what are called people with blood on their hands. The lives of soldiers are also threatened if the Israeli government fails to respond to the captors' demands. If, as most authorities maintain, danger to the captive's life is not a mitigating cause for the leniency in the amount of ransom which can be offered, then such an exchange must be prohibited. This is particularly true if we recognize the danger of the state of Israel in releasing terrorists who are likely to resume their activities and giving a boost to the morale of the organizations who sponsor terror. even if we are to suggest that the status of our captives is one of certain danger, whereas freed terrorists are merely possible danger, the law, according to most authorities, is that we don't risk the life of one to save another. The halakha prohibits ransom which is beyond the value of the captive. Halevi suggests that the context of the Mishnah is different from contemporary times and therefore is not relevant. Whereas Rabbi Galinkin takes the position that the Mishnah's purpose is in protecting the public, even if that means sacrificing the individual. And that is the meaning of the plain meaning of the Mishnah, and has much relevancy today as it did when the Mishnah was written. Those are our texts on captives, redeeming captives. If you thought you were going to walk out of here with a clear answer to what we should do, I apologize, you have another thing coming. I am very glad that I am not in the position to be making these decisions. We are watching them unfold in front of us. One of the things we have to ask ourselves when we've seen, thank God, 4 captives released, is we have to ask ourselves, why were these captives chosen? The first 2, because they were, my gut is, I have no more information than any of you, but my gut is they were American captives. The second 2 both have husbands who are still captive. They're elderly. One is 85, the other is 79, but they both have captive husbands who remain in Gaza. So when they're sitting there on TV talking to you about them eating cucumbers and yogurt along with their Hamas terrorist kidnappers, don't you think for a minute that there isn't something behind why they're saying what they're saying? They are terrified for those people that they know and love who are still in the hell of Gaza's terror tunnels. Okay.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you, Rabbi Faudem, for laying that out so beautifully. Before we dive into these questions, let me just say, in general, I think what Rabbi Faudem has really given us is 2 things. First of all, in a very broad way, one of the beauties about Judaism and our sages is that they didn't settle for just answering the easy questions. They're taking on a very difficult question, a conundrum here where there really is no good answer, and our sages spent centuries trying to figure out, in a situation where there's no good answer, what's the best answer, what's the least bad answer, and they were very sensitive to the fact that not every situation is the same. But they have been working on it for a very long time. Okay, so we've got a couple questions here. All right. Rabbi Faudem, is there a difference between redeeming soldiers and redeeming civilians, or are they equal?
Good. So I think the big difference that we have here is with soldiers are going out and putting themselves in dangerous situations because that's where they are in their lives. Civilians, the Elchanan Tenenbaum situation is really, I think, one of the very few that we have where civilians have been taken hostage. Not that civilians haven't been murdered, but where civilians have been taken hostage. Elchanan Tenenbaum was kind of a shady character that was in financial debt and wound up putting himself in a precarious situation where he got kidnapped. So I don't think that we really have, the other piece that we have is the Munich, the athletes who were kidnapped at Munich, and that didn't go well either for other reasons. I think what we're seeing here with Hamas, and I think it came across very clearly in this morning's interview with Mrs. Lifshitz, is they intended to kidnap civilians. She talked about how they had shampoo and soap, and they had feminine hygiene products, meaning they had tampons and pads, because they were prepared to capture civilians. That was their goal. In terms of redeeming them, I think we're going to find ourselves in a very precarious situation. One of the big differences that we have, that we've already seen, is because some of those civilians are dual citizens from other countries, we're finding those countries are putting pressure on Israel to change how it's going about its strategy, because they're trying to do hostage negotiation. Now, the reality is, we all want to see these people come home. We all want to see that. And our hope is that Israel is going to pull off some sort of miracle where it is gathering that information and is going to be able to free those hostages. I don't know what's going to happen with that. Is there a difference between civilians and IDF soldiers? I'm not sure that is a question. Well, and I mean, if we're going to look at it from this particular case, it's different than the Elchanan Tenenbaum situation, where he put himself in danger. And here you had Israeli civilians who were depending on the Israeli government and the IDF to protect them, and they weren't. So in this case, I would say absolutely not.
Well, let me, before I go to the next one, follow up with this. So the sages have been thinking about this for a long time, but I guess, do you think the sages, the various sages, even the modern, do you think they had any sense that the number of hostages, the number of captives could actually be this large? They seem to be talking about small
numbers.
So,
yep.
So in some sense, we're in very not only precarious territory, we're in unprecedented territory. A large number of captives. And I wonder if the precedent here, if the closest case here is Entebbe, because at Entebbe, you have the kidnapping of 100. You have a large-scale number, and at the time, if I remember correctly, the mantra of the Israeli government, because this wasn't rabbinic time, the mantra of the government was that same old standard: we don't negotiate with terrorists.
But that's never been true.
But that's never, yes, I agree with it.
Israel's negotiated with terrorists from the very beginning. So that's never been true. I think the other difference is when we look at, so one of the things that Professor Lupovitch mentioned was this idea that the sages have been dealing with this for a very long time. One of the brilliant things in Judaism is that we're given a structure, but very few times are we given the answer. What we're given, all of us as Jews and as people who engage with Jewish texts, is we're given the raw materials to grapple with, to figure out when one value goes head to head with another value, which one weighs more in the situation in front of us. What today isn't necessary, what weighs more today in one situation may not weigh more tomorrow in a different situation. We're asked to be thinkers and to push ourselves to try to figure out what is the best answer that we can come up with in the situation in which we find ourselves today. So one of the differences with Entebbe is in Entebbe, all of the hostages were held in one area. In Gaza, they're all being held in different areas, and it's believed that they are being held in these terror tunnels. Gaza is a hellhole. It is a booby trapped place waiting for the Israeli soldiers to come in, to be ambushed, to have people jumping out of these tunnels, jumping out of these angles and small neighborhoods, etc. So Entebbe was a very different piece. The other question we have to ask ourselves is not only do we have to weigh redeeming the captives by exchanging terrorists with the lives that are going to be lost with possible, but we know it's more than possible, future terrorist activities, but what about the soldiers that are going to be lost in going to redeeming those captives? So it's an unprecedented piece here. This idea of this prolonged airstrike is brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. Let's keep bombing away at those places right now where they're hiding, and we all know that these terrorists are cowards, and they hide among civilians because they don't care about human life. They don't care about the people that they're supposed to be representing. They use them as human shields. They're using our hostages, the people who, the Israelis, the Jews, the other non-Jews that are part of this kidnapping scheme. They're using them as bargaining chips, and they'll use them as human shields as well. So it's completely a different, we can't compare it to anything that we've had before, but we can take the pieces that we've had before, pull out what those values are, and try to figure out where those values are replicated in the situation that we have today, and we also need to figure out where those differ.
I agree. I mean, I would just follow up and say that part of the genius of stages is not only do they give us this moral and ethical framework to work in, but they're able to combine the moral and the ethical dimensions with legal categories like certainty versus possibility, and I think the sophistication there is impressive, just like you said. Incidentally, when she was talking, I don't know about you, but in my mind, I was giving her a standing ovation. I don't know about you. I was clapping, but we'll maintain the decorum. Thank you. Now tell us how you really feel. No need to pull punches here. We're all friends. Here's the next question. What about redeeming hostages who are either not Israeli or not Jewish?
What about it?
In other words, are these texts, are the sages, are they talking only specifically about Jews, or are they talking about people?
Okay, so that's two different questions.
The question here was Israeli.
Which is fine.
I added the Jewish part myself.
No, that's fine. So those weren't two different questions. The two different questions are, what are the texts talking about, and then what are we talking about today?
Yeah.
So the texts are talking about Jews and Israelis, because that's what was the immediate group that they were concerned about, especially those earlier texts. Does that make sense? In today's situation, these people, whether Jews or non-Jews, Israelis or non-Israelis, were brutalized and kidnapped under our watch. I believe that makes us responsible just like an Israeli and or a Jew.
Yes, very nicely said. Okay. Isn't every captive in mortal danger? That notion that there's such a thing as not mortal danger for someone who was kidnapped, in reality, that the text that said only in mortal danger, isn't that a little bit of a superficial thing?
It is, but look at Gilad Shalit.
Yes.
Not that he had a good time when he was sitting with Hamas for 5 years, but they kept him. Because why? They're not looking to kill the captives. They did that before, when they beheaded and burned and tore off limbs and brutalized all of those 1,400 people that they terrorized for how many hours. That was just the beginning. These hostages that they've taken, they're not looking at killing them. They are looking at terrorizing and maiming them, but they are bargaining chips, and they want to keep them alive. So a mortal danger, we're going to have to figure out what that means. I'm not sure how you draw a distinction where that line is. Is burning someone on their arm mortal danger or not mortal danger, or what do we, I'm not sure how we figure that piece out, but I don't think that I don't think those that are kidnapped are in mortal danger right now of being murdered by Hamas. That doesn't necessarily mean that we sit around and let them wait for 5 years like Gilad Shalit. But I'm not sure it's mortal danger. And especially earlier at that, in the time period when it was just good business. They weren't in mortal danger. They were, again, a bargaining chip.
Here's a more contemporary question. How much are we to listen to political allies in our decision making? In other words, it's such a gray one. I mean, you can answer that from a Jewish perspective, but I think it's more from a sovereignty Israeli perspective. Is this a decision that Israelis make for themselves, or do others have a say?
What does it mean, have a say?
I'll read it as written. How much are we to listen to political allies in our decision making? You make of that as you please.
How much let's be realistic. We are not, the state of Israel is not independent. The state of Israel is dependent on the United States for a ton of funding. There's also an exchange of information that goes on. I think when you have allies, you do have to take what they say into consideration. I'm not sure your decision needs to be based on what they want. Listen, we're seeing it today. Jeff, when do we? Bottom night, where it said that Israel is delaying its ground incursion to allow the United States to get more military personnel into the region. Now, is that to protect the United States military personnel that's already there? Is it to keep the war from escalating? Is this only something that's going to benefit the United States? I don't think so. I think it's something that's going to benefit Israel too. So in terms of having these discussions, I don't think if we're going to be allies, we can make a decision in a vacuum. But I think at a certain point, Israel has to look and say, we are responsible for our people. And we have seen, unfortunately, very clearly over these past 2.5 weeks, the world does not care about Jews. We are the only ones, there are individuals, don't get me wrong, but the world itself does not care about Jews. How quickly did it turn? I told my husband 3 days, this was Shabbos when the terror attack happened. I told my husband 3 days. We have 3 days where the press is going to be on Israel's side, and then it's going to flip. And lo and behold, Tuesday morning, you already saw it being chipped away, and it started focusing on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which we know can be solved if Hamas releases the kidnapped people. They have the power to do that. They have the power to get electricity back to all of the people that live in Gaza. All they have to do is release those captives. They are making a choice, just like they're making a choice to not share the electricity that they have that's running through the terror tunnels, or the medicine that they have that they're giving to, from Mrs. Lifshitz, they're giving to the captives. They're making a choice to have all of that in the terror tunnels where they are safely living, and they're leaving their constituency, their people, their children, their elderly, all of those horrible pictures that we're seeing all over the news. Hamas is the one that's responsible for that. They can change it. They're making a choice not to, and the world is not holding them accountable for that choice. Shame on the world.
So here's a more specific question. This question is asking you to apply text 4 and 5 directly to the situation right now, based on text 4 and 5.
Yeah.
Explain why Israel would trade one Jew for so many Hamas prisoners.
Good. So this is a text that I actually did not include, and there's a discussion that takes place. Another modern rabbi that talks about, okay, you know what? I don't think we should exchange one, because of this social order, because of not redeeming a captive for more than they're worth. I don't think that we should exchange one soldier for 1,000 terrorists. But then this guy turns around and says, but wait a second. Our soldiers are so much more valuable than 1,000 of these. So the question is what's value? We as Jews value life. There are 3 things for which we are supposed to die for rather than transgress: idolatry, murder, and sexual crimes. Those are 3 things that our God, that's our God's line in the sand. For everything else, we are supposed to transgress and save our lives. For us as Jews, the time period that we look forward to, our greatest time period, is not the past, but rather for us as Jews, it's the future. We hold our kids, our future, at such a high level, we give up a tremendous amount in order to make sure that there is a next Jewish generation. We value our kids, right? It's Golda Meir who said, we will have peace when you love your children more than you hate us. That is value. We value life. They value martyrdom. We don't value martyrdom. We don't look for ways to show our dedication to our God and Judaism through what we're going to die for. We show our dedication to Judaism through how we live here in this world.
We have time. We have time for a couple more questions. So let me toss in one. Let me toss in one of my own here. That's okay. You brought so many great texts, but the one sort of moment of captivity in our history, there was a medieval rabbi, a medieval Ashkenazic rabbi named Meir of Rothenburg. Okay, so Meir of Rothenburg. Long story short, he was basically arrested by the local community and imprisoned, and he gave explicit instructions to his followers not to redeem him for all the reasons that Rabbi Faudem mentioned, based on all these textualities. Now, Meir of Rothenburg is not your typical individual. What he did, that act of courage, you correct me if I'm wrong, is not something we would expect an ordinary person to do. He was Meir of Rothenburg. I guess the question I would ask in applying the story of Meir of Rothenburg to today is it reasonable? Is it reasonable to expect a soldier to be more like Meir of Rothenburg than it is to expect an ordinary civilian to do it? In other words, a soldier is a soldier.
Correct.
A soldier
That's their job.
There is that sacred oath of the soldier, and there's a presumption of courage and bravery and strength when you're in uniform that you wouldn't necessarily make some kid or some just ordinary civilian. So you think that? Well, I'll ask it 2 ways. Is Meir of Rothenburg, that story, a model that we can apply right now? And in applying that model, would you differentiate soldiers from civilians?
I'm not, and I actually did not bring that text as well. The Meir of Rothenburg, the Rabbi Rothenburg piece, he did it, he said it himself. It was not another body that was saying, I am not redeeming you. He said to the community, if you redeem me for this exorbitant amount of money, then all it's going to do is whet the appetite for them to kidnap more great leaders because they know we're going to redeem them. He said, you know what? I'm a great leader, but I've trained many students. Torah is going to go on without me. And he died in prison because they didn't let him out, and he refused to allow them to redeem him because he was afraid of what the next step where that was going to lead. I don't know how old he was when he made that decision, but I guarantee you he was not the age of our Israeli soldiers. Now, again, each soldier is going to be different. I don't know what each soldier would say. I know that there are soldiers who would say, absolutely not. Do not redeem me for this many terrorists. But the reality is, you know as well as I do, God forbid any of us find ourselves in a situation. What I say right here, right now, might be very different than if, God forbid, I find myself in that situation. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense, yes.
So I think that's, I can tell you what I would do, X, Y, and Z. That's good for right here. Find myself in such a situation, I might find myself, the reality is, my answer is.
Great answer. I should say another great answer. Last question. I think we have time for one last one. And this is asking very specifically about redeeming the remains of a dead captive. So, when with respect to redeeming the remains of an Israeli, do the terrorists care for the deceased in a respectful way? This is a slightly tangential question. How do we know we are exchanging? Well, this is a different question. Why don't we start with that question first? I mean, is there a different situation when we're redeeming the remains of a soldier or the remains of a captive who's not alive? If it's just, in other words, just redeeming the remains of the deceased, is that different from redeeming someone who's still alive?
So in Judaism, we have it's a huge mitzvah to bury another Jew. It's the biggest mitzvah you can do because the person can't do it themselves, and they can't say thank you to you for doing it. So you're doing it purely out of, who said love? Yeah, so you're doing it purely out of, and to make sure that that person's body is put into the earth so that when the Messiah comes and there's resurrection of the dead, whether we believe it or not, we don't have to talk about right now, that person is going to be able to rise from the dead and go on for their resurrected life. We put there's a tremendous amount of care and respect that we pay to a dead body. I think there is a difference, though, in terms of someone who has their life ahead of them and someone who, unfortunately, has already been killed. So I think that's why we've seen sometimes these dead the soldiers' bodies. Right. We still have, Hamas is holding, I don't know how many bodies or body parts of IDF soldiers who have been killed over the years, who have been declared dead because we had enough raw materials to be able to make that declaration, but we still don't have those bodies. I can't imagine being a family member of one of those people and not being able to bury that person or know that their body is not being desecrated. If we think that Hamas is treating the dead bodies respectfully, I would direct your attention to Exhibit 1,400 and however many people were slaughtered on October 7th.
I agree, and I would add that I think it is a tribute to, Judaism, state of Israel, how moral Judaism is and how moral the state of Israel, that we're even contemplating as a case, as a possibility, the importance of redeeming a captive who is dead.
Yep.
I think, I don't want to brag here, but I think that's one of the ways in which, morally, but that's just one guy's opinion. I think that ends all the questions. So look, I want to thank Rabbi Faudem for answering all these questions. It was really wonderful. Now we're gonna. Right?
Yes, second piece. Yep, absolutely. Good. We're good with the questions?
We're going to read the Mishnah Berach now?
No, not yet. We have the second part of the talking.
Oh, okay.
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 Okay. So the second piece of this, which is a sheet that you've received in your packet, it's on white pages. And what I've put together, I've compiled, and thank you to Professor Lupovitch for sharing his notes with me. You have two pieces. This is a 4-page document, 3-page document. You have two pieces in here. The first we're not going to look at right now. The first are 3 answers, and this is directly from Professor Lupovitch, to common anti-Zionist tropes. The 3 are Zionism as colonialism, Zionism as racism, and Zionism in terms of apartheid, that it equals all 3 of those things. You can read Professor Lupovitch's very brilliant answers to those at your own time. What I would like to focus on are pieces that we can answer or have in our back pockets to people with whom we might find ourselves in discussion where we have very different approaches, answers, stands on this issue. So I am on the first page, but the second side, after number 3. I'm in the middle of that page where it says, Palestinians just want liberation from Israel so their land will be no longer occupied. Does everyone see where I am?
Yeah.
Okay. In response, we should argue, Israelis withdrew from Gaza in 2005. Hamas gained control of the territory in 2007. Instead of investing in schools, hospitals, and civil infrastructure, Hamas invested in its terror infrastructure and rockets to target Israeli citizens. Hamas consistently places Palestinians who live in Gaza in harm's way and uses civilians as a human shield, hiding their terrorist cells in neighborhoods where it is more challenging to root out this evil. And this goes against the IDF's moral code, where they don't want to kill civilians. Right? Here you've got Hamas taking advantage of that. What do they know? Israel goes to all ends of the earth to kill as few civilians as possible. It's a very difficult thing to do when Hamas embeds themselves and stores their rockets on playgrounds and schools and hospitals. They know it plays well in the press, in the media, of dead Gazans on the ground. And they know the Israelis have a difficult time with that because we're moral people. So dropping leaflets, making phone calls or texts saying, please leave the area because we're going to bomb on this day at this time. I don't know any other army that tells its enemy when it's coming in.
You know, one of the few times it's happened, like in, history, is before the bombing of Nagasaki, the United States Army dropped leaflets on the city. That's the only other example I know. That was long, long time ago. Point is well taken. Nobody does this.
Hamas indiscriminately seeks to destroy all Israel, not just to control their strip. Hamas's charter, which Professor Lupovitch you spoke about last week, calls for the destruction of the state of Israel and the killing of Jews. The terrorism taking place in Israel today is not about forming a Palestinian state. It's about targeting innocent Israeli civilians and wreaking havoc on all of Israeli society. Hamas is not interested in being a partner for peace. They are interested in wiping Israel off the map. Those are two different things. There's a difference between Hamas and Palestinians. Not every Palestinian is in favor of Hamas. That's important for us to know. Israel has made living conditions intolerable in Gaza, and its aggression has created the context and circumstances that led to this recent conflict. See the first bullet point above. We left in 2005. Hamas has been the governing structure in the Gaza Strip since 2006, 2007. They are responsible for the living conditions of their people. They've made choice after choice after choice to spend their money on their terrorist infrastructure as opposed to educational opportunities, medicine, bomb shelters for their people, or anything of the like. They are responsible for their own choices. For decades, Israel has endorsed a two-state solution that would lead to a Palestinian state. Palestinian leadership has repeatedly rejected proposals from both left and right-wing governments for two-state solutions. I give you dates there of those different offerings. The Palestinian response should be to negotiate with Israel, not attack civilian communities. Palestinian voices and leaderships need to outwardly condemn Hamas and their actions. Any attempt to justify and rationalize Hamas's terror is abhorrent. There is no moral equivalency to what is taking place.
Could I add one other point there? In Hamas's charter, and I mean both the original in 1987 and the revised one, Hamas isn't only opposed to the existence of the State of Israel, but the charter 100% opposes any diplomatic initiative, any notion of compromise, any notion of negotiation. That is considered not only treason to the Palestinian people, but also heresy against Islam, negotiate in any way.
Israel is committing genocide, I jumped down a little bit, and destroying innocent lives in Gaza. Why should these innocents be held accountable for acts of Palestinian terrorists? Israel has a moral obligation to protect its citizens and to recover Israeli citizens, women, elderly, children, young mothers, teenagers who are being held hostage by Hamas terrorists in the heart of Gaza. Israeli hostages have been kidnapped, raped, and maimed because of their identity as Israelis. Unfortunately, innocent people will die and lives will be lost, but this is because Hamas is not interested in the value of Palestinian lives, Palestinian dignity, and a future Palestinian state. Quite the contrary. Hamas consistently places Palestinians who live in Gaza in harm's way and uses civilians as human shields, hiding their terrorist cells in neighborhoods where it is more challenging to root out this evil. Genocide, listen closely, is the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. Israel is trying to destroy Hamas, not Palestinians. That distinction must be made clear. Why is Israel cutting off electricity and other supplies to Gaza? In response, we should argue, Hamas, elected by the people of Gaza, is the authority in charge of the Strip and responsible for the well-being of its citizens. If the hostages are released, Israel has said that it will immediately resume electricity and other supplies, even though, in the past, the regime has diverted large quantities of provisions and aid for military and terror purposes, while its wealthy leadership has squandered urgent resources for themselves, those Hamas leaders that are actually in the Strip, as opposed to are hiding out in Qatar or wherever else they're hiding. For example, we have seen again and again that emergency supplies of much-needed diesel fuel used for generators and hospitals has been redirected to Hamas's rocket program and other military uses. It should be noted that in regular times, Israel only supplies 10% of Gaza's water and 50% of its electricity. A further 25% comes from solar power and the rest from Egypt and other sources. So we were trying to put together some sort of document that hits these points that we're commonly hearing over and over again, so we can all have in our back pocket some information to redirect this misinformation. The big one is, we've been out since 2005. Now, words matter. We are not dealing with militia or militants or freedom fighters. Hamas are terrorists. Our people were not killed on October 7th. They were slaughtered on October 7th. These are words that we need to make sure that we are using, and when we hear them differently, freedom fighters, no, 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 no. Freedom fighters don't barge into homes and murder babies along with their mothers. They don't do that. Hamas is not looking to establish a Palestinian state. They are looking at wiping the Jewish state off the map. They do not care about the Palestinians. They care about eradicating us. And if you think we are exempt, we are not. Once they finish there, they're going out after the rest of us. It's all included in the charter.
I would just add that it's there explicitly in 1987. So for 29 years it was there, or 30 years it was there explicitly. Now they tamped down that language in the 2017 one. However, the rhetoric that Hamas has used since 2017 is still perfectly consistent with the language and the aims of the 1987 original charter. I think what Hamas has learned to do in 30 years is they've learned the value of misinformation and disinformation. There are parts of that revised charter which are just, frankly, they're just making stuff up, contradicting itself, but their actual rhetoric and what they're doing, and they keep finding these recordings of Hamas soldiers, look how happy I am to be killing Jews. Yes, in fact, despite the revised charter, they're still following the original one. If I could just add one other layer of an argument. When you make the point that, yes, Israel pulled out in 2005, and it's been Hamas ruling through 2007. The counter argument you will hear is, but there has been a blockade. So no, Israel isn't there, but they're not letting anything in, and that's why things couldn't get any better. That's the point you use the humanitarian aid argument. Yes, Israel was blockading for security reasons, but all this millions of dollars in humanitarian aid was still getting in, despite the blockade, and was being diverted for military purposes. That I think is how the argument is structured a little bit stronger. You can you nip one other counter argument in the bud as you go.
Yeah. Okay. So here's a question.
Yeah.
Is there not any Palestinian or Arab groups that will speak out against Hamas? For example, Egypt closed its borders so as not to let Hamas into their country. The UAE and Jordan made an agreement with Israel. Do they not believe that peace is better than war with Israel? Why won't they speak out? Okay, so that's a loaded question.
Great question.
You want to go first?
I can take a stab at that question. I mean, the simple part of the answer, certainly for Egypt doesn't want an influx of Palestinians. I think civilian Palestinians, there's the economic drain, but I think that would be fine. What they don't want are Palestinians coming in who are sympathetic or somehow allied with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a transnational, I would say, radical organization that tends to be very violent. Egypt doesn't want anything to do with anything that's going to feed that kind of, let's call it terrorist or violent extremism. Ditto, Jordan doesn't want that, or the Emirates. Nobody wants to let that in. And, if they could be certain that the only Palestinians they were letting in were nonviolent Palestinians, and it might be 90%. It could be very high, but if in that influx they're letting in, violent people, it's going to cause their own problem. I mean, they're going to act in their own self-interest. Egypt is not closing a border because it's cooperating with Israel. Egypt is closing a border because it's cooperating with Egypt. And ditto, each country is making the decision in their own self-interest to say, taking on more Palestinians, and what it connotes is a headache that we just don't want. Now, at this point, they're still relying on the fact that the plight of the Palestinians, for some strange reason, is not being blamed on Egypt or Qatar or Jordan. It's just being blamed on Israel. So the rest of these countries have it really easy. We're not taking anybody, and we're not going to have any blame for it. We're going to walk away scot-free because we got the scapegoat over there who's going to have to take the fall for it.
I mean, Egypt is economically bad off. They don't want the Palestinians. And in 56,
Right.
right, Israel captured the Gaza
Yeah.
Strip and then gave it back to Egypt. In 67, when Israel captured the Gaza Strip, Egypt said, we don't want it back.
No, nobody wants us. Now, the other question in terms of Palestinians standing up to Hamas, this is a big part of the problem. What we haven't seen, not just in terms of Hamas, standing up to Hamas, in general, the Palestinians have not produced that kind of leader or leadership. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there was, I think I alluded to this a little bit last week, there was Arafat, who turned out to be, problematic in many ways. The current PA leadership is corrupt. They've lost a lot of the support of the people. The Palestinian leadership at this moment is defaulting to Hamas in the absence of anything else. Why doesn't anyone stand up? First of all, it's dangerous. You see, we have the Sadat example. Sadat was very courageous to do what he did, but he paid for it with his life. And I think in some ways it's even more dangerous for someone Palestinian to do it. Stand up and to not even try to be a leader, but to dissent in any way.
I mean, to be parv.
What's that?
To be parv.
To be non-supportive, to be ardently supportive. When we speak about the notion of a free election in Gaza, maybe, but I think it's just as likely as that just because it's an election doesn't mean it's a free and fair election. If people think that their life is in jeopardy, they're in some kind of peril, if they don't vote a certain way, then they're going to vote a certain way. So Hamas can claim, yes, we got 80% of the voters, some ridiculously high number. That election was never, there was never the infrastructure or the bureaucracy to be able to certify if it was a free and fair election. It might have been, but it might not have been. There's a lot of fear there. I mean, this is like living in a town owned by a crime syndicate. It's difficult. So there's a certain amount of courage for Palestinians to stand up. Will it never happen? It might happen. It's going to take a lot of bravery to be able to do that. But maybe, I think one of the best things that could happen to Israel is if there emerged a Palestinian leadership that actually was genuinely interested in genuinely negotiating with Israel. But to this point, it's really never happened. They haven't produced that person yet.
And I do think that with the UAE, with the Abraham Accords,
right,
that could be a way in which we can somehow, because the big question that is being floated around right now is what happens the day after the ground incursion. But you're going to have a void there. So what's Israel's plan afterwards? You have to have an exit strategy, and who's going to fill that void? Well, just as Professor Lupovitch said, there isn't anyone who's been able to emerge from the Palestinian leadership to take on that role. But if we can get a group together, and you've got these, between the UAE, Abraham Accords, all of these places that didn't want relations with Israel, who all of a sudden realize, I don't think it's all of a sudden, who have realized Israel's not going away, the Palestinians aren't giving us anything, and we actually don't live like Hamas wants us to live. We should make deals with Israel because that's going to be financially beneficial to us. I think if we can somehow get some of these Abraham Accords countries to be part of a group that will then fill in this void or help create a new government for the Palestinians, I think we have a shot at a two-state solution. But we have to get to that point. The other thing that we have to remember is we as Americans, we have a very different view on life. First of all, we have free access to information, and we're also pretty highly educated. You don't have that among the Gazans, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably many in the West Bank as well.
There are more. More are educated and more are middle class.
But I think
the point is still well taken.
I think the role religion plays, and we talked about this last week at Wayne.
Less in Gaza and less in the West Bank than in Gaza. And I think the trick is in Gaza is, I think most Gazan Palestinians and themselves, not necessarily religious, but they're living under a government, under a rulership, which is insistent on a certain level, on a certain standard.
I think, go back to Saudi Arabia, we were going to have these talks, and now Saudi Arabia, look at the word that they used, they paused. They didn't say they backed out.
And they didn't condemn.
They didn't condemn, they paused. So why aren't they speaking out? I think a lot of it's the bully mentality and the bystander mentality. I'm not sure that Professor Lupovitch is going to support me if I take a step outside of the comfort zone. Therefore, I'm not necessarily going to take a step. If I know that he's going to support me, then the two of us together, that's a different story, right? We have a little bit of power there. I think that's what the countries are afraid of, and I think also the countries are afraid of the street. What's the street going to say? We're seeing all the rioting going on. My God, there was just something at Bloomfield Hills High School today. There was, right? So, we're seeing it all over. U of M has horrible, Michigan State, it's all over the place. Wayne, we're having issues. It's all over the place.
All over.
Pardon?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I think there's some of this bully mentality, and who's going to be the person who's going to have the courage to stand up, and is there going to be someone behind them that's going to help them and stand with them? Or, we had a walkout last week, right? You can tell the story.
Oh, you mean on
Yeah.
campus? I don't know what story.
We were just talking about it.
Who was?
Last week, Professor Lupovitch.
Oh, I thought you meant a university walkout. No, we had an event last week where our colleague Saeed Khan, we were talking together about Israel and the situation there. At the very beginning, as soon as it started, a group of about maybe 20, 25 students, presumably Palestinian, just stood up and walked out of the auditorium. They walked out on us. It was a very dignified and very respectful walkout, but a walkout nonetheless. It was a moment. But yeah, those things are happening right now.
But in Saeed's class.
Right. But Saeed, he actually had some of the students in his class that, this event was on Thursday. The following Monday, he actually spoke to some of these students, and the students said, "We just walked out because of peer pressure. We wanted to stay and hear the conversation, but the peer pressure and all. And these are young people, so if that's what everyone is doing, that's what everyone is doing. I don't think they were afraid of being harmed, but they just don't want to, they didn't want to miss out on the party or the, peer pressure, kids. I would just say that, first of all, I will always support you. You don't have to worry about that. But secondly, also, in terms of other countries intervening, the economics will not be a problem. They're all waiting to benefit from the economic advantages of allying with Israel. The real nub of the problem is administration. Nobody wants to take on the task of trying to figure out how to govern Gaza, because the place is an absolute mess, economically, socially, infrastructure, social services. It really has to be built from scratch. It's just, it has been let to deteriorate really at least since 2005, if not longer. So taking that on as a burden, as an administrative burden, is different than taking on some kind of economic burden. Those two things are not exactly the same. So if Israel could negotiate or convince one of these countries or multiple of these countries to actually take it on, that would be great. I think they're also concerned that even though they're Muslim and the Palestinians are Muslim, they'll still be seen as foreign rule. The notion of being under foreign rule, I don't think it's going to matter. Maybe it'll matter a little bit less because it's not Israel, but being under the Saudis or the Egyptians or the Qataris or the Jordanians, they'll be pushed back against that too.
I'm so sorry. That hour and a half just flew by. I just think you two. Why we haven't put you two together sooner in our classes is beyond my comprehension, but I just hope that you all gain some knowledge here. Our whole attempt here is that I know the entire community is feeling so helpless. At JLearn, we believe knowledge is power. I know everybody's ready to get out. We've got one last little thing. We really want to show our strength with the Mishaberach and send our love and healing thoughts to everybody that is hurting in Israel, the hostages, the victims' families. all of us Jews. So with that, I thank you all for being with us. I hope that we're able to bring you some more information as things move along. And this will be, as I said, recorded and sent out. And Michele,